My name is Sophia, and this is the story of how a series of unexpected encounters changed my life forever. It had only been a week since our wedding, and I already felt something inside me was changing. I was just 20 years old, and life opened up before me like an infinite road of possibilities. My husband, Marco, was the love of my life, or so I thought until that moment. I had met him at university, and in less than a year together, we had decided to get married. If you want to find out how these unexpected encounters transformed my life and questioned everything I believed, subscribe to the channel. Everything had been perfect. The white dress, the church ceremony, the honeymoon. But despite this, there was a sense of emptiness that I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just the adrenaline wearing off after weeks of intense emotions, or maybe it was my young age that made me uncertain. Upon returning from the honeymoon, our daily routine quickly returned. Marco resumed work in the office, and I often found myself alone at home, lost in my thoughts. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what was wrong. I told myself that this was normal, that marriage would take time to feel like a new normal, but those words couldn't calm the unease growing inside me. One morning, while I was walking through the park near my house, still surrounded by the euphoria of the first days of marriage, I met someone who I never imagined could turn my life upside down. His name was Antonio. He was 60 years old, with gray hair and dark eyes that seemed to tell stories of distant experiences. He was sitting on a bench, with a newspaper folded on his knees. When I passed him, our eyes met, and a strange shock ran through my body. I couldn't say why, but there was something about him that attracted me uncontrollably. It wasn't just his mature appearance, but also the calm and confidence that shone through his gaze, like an echo of wisdom and experience that seemed to be missing in my life. After that meeting, I started going to the park more and more often. Marco was always busy with work, and I felt more and more alone and bored. Antonio was there every morning, sitting on the same bench. At first, we simply exchanged brief pleasantries. The weather, the flowers in the park, a few comments on politics. Slowly, though, those conversations started to get deeper. He told me about his life experiences, the trips he had taken, the people he had loved and lost. Antonio's every word seemed to open a window into a world I had never known. He spoke to me with disarming sincerity, without ever seeming intrusive. I also began to confide in him, something I never thought I would do with a stranger. I talked to him about my marriage, about my fears, about that feeling of emptiness that I couldn't explain. He listened to me with a patience and understanding that was unknown to me. His every piece of advice was like a little lighthouse in the fog, and I began to look to his words as a kind of comfort. One day, while we were walking together in the park, Antonio told me about his passion for reading. He recommended a book that he thought could help me understand myself better. The next day, I showed up at the park with that book in hand, and he seemed genuinely impressed that I had followed his advice. We read a few pages together, sitting on that same bench, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. I felt a connection that went beyond words, something that made me feel understood and accepted, like never before. As the weeks passed, our conversations became a daily ritual. Every morning I woke up with the anticipation of those moments spent with Antonio. Marco was increasingly distant, immersed in his work, and unaware of the turmoil that was growing inside me. The routine of my marriage seemed to be emptied of meaning, while my meetings with Antonio became the focus of my days. I felt torn between the guilt for what I was experiencing and the inexplicable joy I felt every time I was with him. Antonio, with his calm and his way of seeing life, had rekindled a spark in me that I thought I had lost. Yet as the days passed, I began to wonder where all this would take me. I knew I was walking a thin line, but I couldn't stop. The call of that new emotion was too strong, too engaging, and so I continued to follow that path, unaware of the consequences that awaited me on the horizon. After that kiss, something between Antonio and me changed profoundly. The desire between us grew more and more every day, but we still hadn't crossed that definitive line. It almost seemed that both of us, unconsciously, wanted to prolong that wait, as if it were the only way to keep the magic of our bond intact. Every time we met, our eye game became more intense, our hands touched more often, and my heart beat wildly every time I got close to him. His words, often simple, had an extraordinary power over me. They made me feel special, desired, and ignited emotions in me that I didn't know I could feel. But at home, with Marco, I felt more and more distant. He was the same caring and loving man he always was, but I could no longer look him in the eyes without feeling overwhelmed by a wave of guilt. Every time he asked me how my day was, I responded with vague sentences, trying to hide my double life. It was like living in two parallel worlds. On the one hand, there was the devout and smiling young wife. On the other, the restless and passionate woman who abandoned herself to temptation. The nights with Marco were cold. I couldn't let go like I used to anymore. Every caress, every hug felt forced, as if my body belonged to someone else. Sometimes, I found myself watching him sleep, wondering if he ever noticed how much I had changed. Even though I was still tied to him, a part of me was already far away, lost in those forbidden thoughts about Antonio. Several weeks passed, and despite my attempts to maintain control of the situation, I began to notice that Marco was becoming more and more suspicious. He asked me more often where I went and who I spent time with. His searching eyes seemed to be searching for something I was desperately trying to hide. One evening, while we were having dinner together, Marco looked at me for a long time in silence. "Is everything okay, love?" he asked in a calm voice, but with a slight hint of concern. It took me by surprise, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. A shiver of fear ran through my body. "Yes, certainly." "Why do you ask me this?" I replied, trying to keep my tone as natural as possible. "You're different lately," he continued. "I often see you lost in your thoughts. You are no longer the same as you were a few months ago." His words hit me in the heart. It was true. I wasn't the same anymore, and he was noticing it. I forced a smile and quickly changed the subject, talking about trivial things to distract him. But deep down, I knew I was walking a thin tightrope, and that sooner or later, the truth would come out. Every unspoken word between us seemed to add weight to the invisible wall that was rising between him and me. Every day, my internal struggle became more intense. On the one hand, there was the part of me that loved Marco, that wanted to protect our marriage and keep the promise I had made to him. On the other hand, there was that desire for freedom, to completely let myself go to that desire for Antonio, that consumed me more and more. I kept meeting Antonio, but every time we were close to the point of no return, I backed away. There was an invisible barrier that I still couldn't overcome, a thin thread that still tied me to my usual life. He never forced me. He was patient. He knew how to wait. And perhaps it was precisely this that attracted me even more. There was no pressure from him, just a latent, ever-present desire that made me feel alive. Every look of his, every gesture, seemed full of hidden meanings, as if behind his calm there was a fire equal to mine. One afternoon, after yet another tense meeting, Antonio proposed something different to me. "I'd like to take you out of town, away from everything, just the two of us, without worries," he told me in a low, seductive tone. His words came to me like a forbidden whisper, an invitation to escape from everything. My heart stopped for a moment. I knew that this trip would mean another step towards the inevitable. It was a dangerous but incredibly tempting proposition. "I don't know if I can," I replied hesitantly, trying to mask my desire. "Marco would notice." Antonio looked at me with his penetrating eyes. "We'll figure something out. I need to spend time with you, away from all this. Just the two of us." The mere thought of running away with him, even for just a weekend, made me lose my mind. But I knew I was playing with fire. If I had accepted, it would have been the point of no return. However, the temptation was too strong. My days were now dominated by that thought, and my mind continued to imagine forbidden scenarios. I saw myself with him, away from everything, without the mask I wore every day. Each mental image made me feel more and more trapped, between desire and fear. I went home that evening with my mind in turmoil. My head was spinning, unable to make a decision. If I had accepted Antonio's invitation, I would have definitively broken every promise I had made to Marco. But on the other hand, my rebellious soul pushed me to take risks, to give in to that desire that grew inside me like an uncontrollable fire. While I was sitting on the sofa, staring into space, Marco sat next to me. "Are you sure everything is okay?" he asked once again, his voice gentle but concerned. I looked at him and felt a pang in my heart. He didn't deserve all this. He didn't deserve to be betrayed. But I couldn't stop what I felt. "If you were in Sophia's shoes, would you feel overwhelmed by temptation, or would you try to resist to save the marriage? Write it in the comments." I stood up suddenly, looking for an excuse to leave. The truth was that I was running from my own conscience. I locked myself in the bathroom, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I no longer recognized that 20-year-old girl who had gotten married just a few weeks earlier. My life was falling apart, but Antonio's call was too strong. I knew deep down that I would have to make a decision soon, and that decision would change everything. My reflection in the mirror looked at me with new eyes, full of doubt and a strange excitement about the unknown. In the end, I decided to accept Antonio's invitation. I was tired of fighting against myself, against that desire that consumed me more and more every day. I lied to Marco, telling him that an old family friend had invited me to spend a weekend out of town to relax and get away from the routine. He didn't suspect anything, or so it seemed, and accepted my explanation without asking questions. On the day of departure, I felt a strange emotion, fear mixed with excitement while I was packing my bag. I'd never done something so daring in my life, and yet I felt drawn to the unknown, to the possibility of being someone else, even just for a few days. Antonio picked me up in the car, and once I got in, the world seemed to stop. There were no words between us as we drove away from the city. The tension in the air was palpable, almost unbearable, and we both knew this weekend would change everything. We arrived in a small mountain town, far from the chaos and prying eyes. It was a perfect place to hide, to let go without the weight of the reality that awaited us upon our return. The hotel was elegant, yet discreet, perfect for what we were looking for, a retreat from the world. Every detail seemed designed to isolate us from the rest of the world. The silence of the mountain, the scent of wood in the air, the warm light of the room that enveloped us. Once we entered the room, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. It was all real, and there was no turning back. The outside world seemed to have dissolved, leaving us alone with our desires and fears. Sophia looked at me with a look I had never seen before, deep, full of desire. The room was illuminated only by a soft light, and the atmosphere seemed suspended in time, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. We sat on the bed, next to each other without speaking. The silence was broken only by the beating of my heart, which seemed to explode in my chest. Every breath seemed amplified, every little movement filled with meaning. I felt the heat of his body close to mine, and his hand that gently touched my leg made me tremble, like a shock that ran through every fiber of my being. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Antonio asked me. The tone of his voice, low and deep, vibrated in the air like an irresistible call. He knew that once he crossed that threshold, there would be no return. I looked into his eyes, searching for an answer that I couldn't find with words. He nodded without saying anything. There was nothing left to say. My body spoke for me, responding to a need that I could no longer ignore. I moved closer to him, and our lips met again, but this time with an uncontrollable passion. There was no hesitation, just the desire to surrender completely. His hands began to explore my body confidently, as if he had always known how to touch me. Every caress, every kiss was a crescendo of emotions, and I let myself go completely to that moment, without thinking about what would happen next. His hand slipped under my shirt, and I shivered at the feel of his skin against mine. It was a sensation that seemed to awaken every cell in my body. There was no longer room for doubts or guilt. In that moment, everything felt right, like it was the only thing I had ever wanted. We undressed slowly, without haste, savoring every second as a precious gift. Every layer of clothing that fell to the floor was a step towards the inevitable, towards a betrayal that I had now agreed to commit. Our naked bodies touched, and the electricity between us reached its peak. There were no more barriers, neither mental nor physical. I felt alive like never before, as if every breath was filled with new energy. Antonio pushed me gently onto the bed and placed himself on top of me. His eyes scrutinized me as if they wanted to discover every corner of my soul, explore every hidden secret. There were no more breaks, only pure and uncontrollable desire. We let ourselves be carried away by that whirlwind of passion, and the whole world around us seemed to vanish. The act of betrayal was sweet and overwhelming. Every touch, every movement seemed to respond to a desire we had repressed for too long. My hands clung to his shoulders, seeking stability in a sea of emotions that seemed endless. In that moment, I didn't think about Marco. I didn't think about the consequences. Only Antonio and I existed, alone in that universe of passion that we had created. After consummating the betrayal, we lay down next to each other, breathing heavily. The silence in the room was deafening, but full of meaning. I felt dizzy, as if I had walked through a dream too real to forget. Antonio stroked my hair with a delicacy that contrasted with the intensity of just before, but I couldn't relax completely. The adrenaline mixed with the awareness of what I had just done, which began to make its way into my mind like a slow but inexorable weight. I turned onto my side and looked at him, searching his eyes for an answer. But he said nothing. There was no need. Our bond was now sealed by something much stronger, but also more dangerous. The weight of the betrayal was starting to crush me, but at the same time I couldn't feel completely burdened by it. There was a part of me that finally felt free, finally alive. We sat in silence for a few minutes, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, Antonio got up and dressed slowly, each gesture filled with a calm that seemed surreal. "We need to get back to reality," he said with a light smile, although there was a trace of melancholy in his eyes. I followed him with my eyes as he dressed. Every movement seemed to mark the end of that suspended moment. I wondered what would happen from then on. I knew that my life would never be the same again, that I would have to face the consequences of my actions. But at that moment, I was still under the influence of that night of passion, unable to think rationally. The journey home was silent. Antonio accompanied me home, and during the journey, I tried to mentally prepare myself for the moment I would see Marco again. Every meter I walked felt like a step towards a truth I wasn't ready to face. I knew I couldn't hide what had happened for long, but I wasn't ready to face it yet. I felt torn in two. Part of me wanted to forget everything and go back to my normal life, while the other part wanted to relive every moment spent with Antonio. When we arrived at my house, Antonio turned towards me and took my hand. "This isn't the end of it," he told me in a firm voice, each word seeming to be carved in the air. "You know it too." I looked at it for a moment, trying to understand what it meant to me. Then I nodded wordlessly. It wasn't over, and I knew it well. What we had started was only the beginning of something much more complex and dangerous. He greeted me with a light kiss on the lips. Then I watched him walk away, knowing that this weekend would be just the first chapter of an even more intricate story. When I returned home, wrapped in Marco's arms, I felt as if I was wearing a mask. His embrace was warm and comforting, but something dark and forbidden stirred inside me. Looking into his eyes, so unaware, a pang of guilt tried to creep in, but I pushed it away firmly. I couldn't allow myself to collapse. The week passed quickly, and life seemed to return to normal. Marco was busy with work, and I returned to the daily routine. Every time my thoughts returned to that weekend with Antonio, my heart beat faster. But I soon learned to hide any trace of disturbance behind calm smiles and formal words. Antonio kept sending me messages. They were short, but every word was full of that desire that had overwhelmed us. I knew I should have stopped. I should have closed that door for Marco's sake. But every time I saw Antonio's name pop up on my screen, I couldn't resist. Our relationship had become a dark secret that I guarded carefully, and every encounter with him was like adding fuel to a fire. The first time she cheated on him again was just a few weeks later. We found an excuse to meet in another city. Once again, I lied to Marco, inventing an excuse that sounded more and more convincing. He didn't suspect anything. He believed me without hesitation, and I was now getting used to that double life. That role of perfect wife on the one hand, and forbidden lover on the other. The relationship with Antonio became increasingly intense and secret. We met in hotels, in hidden places, away from the eyes of anyone who might recognize us. Each time, the risk of getting caught made everything even more exciting. The lies I told Marco became more and more elaborate, and each new lie seemed to build an increasingly fragile castle. But he never showed any signs of suspicion. He seemed to trust me completely, and I exploited that trust, now completely immersed in that dangerous game. As the months passed, I began to understand that perhaps Marco would never find out anything. My relationship with Antonio remained hidden in a dark corner of my life, away from everyone's sight. I continued to be the loving and attentive wife to Marco, and he gave me no reason to doubt him. But every time I found myself alone with Antonio, something inside me lit up. Every look, every touch seemed to fuel a flame that I couldn't put out. a flame that had now become part of myself. A part of me that I could no longer control had become accustomed to living in compromise. The sense of guilt, so acute at the beginning, had now subsided. I had adapted to lying, to living in two separate worlds, as if they were two parallel realities. I had become an expert in the art of the double life. The devoted wife and the hidden lover had merged into one person, and I had convinced myself that, as long as I was cautious, no one would ever find out my secret. Meanwhile, my relationship with Luca continued without a hitch. He was always affectionate, thoughtful, a husband that many would have described as ideal, and I did everything I could to maintain the appearance of a happy relationship. I prepared elaborate dinners, smiled at his stories, and organized romantic evenings, all to fuel that image of perfection. But inside me I knew that there was a part of me that he would never know, a dark, forbidden side that belonged only to Giorgio. Every time I returned home after one of my clandestine meetings, I found myself smiling and acting as if nothing had happened. I had perfected the art of masking every emotion, of keeping everything under control. Luca would never find out anything. I was now certain of it. Time passed, and with it, my relationship with Giorgio became an integral part of my life. Every message, every secret look, every forbidden touch fueled a desire that seemed impossible to tame. I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I couldn't stop. It was like an addiction, a constant thrill that pushed me to seek more and more. Every meeting with him was a dive into the unknown, a moment of escape from the daily routine. I felt alive, electrified, even if it meant walking a thin line between euphoria and doom. Eventually, I learned to live with my secret. Luca never suspected anything, and I continued to live my double life, maintaining the balance between the two parts of me. Every lie I told became more natural, and with time, even my feelings of guilt seemed to fade. There was no longer the initial torment, but only a cold awareness. I had chosen this path, and I would follow it to the end. Giorgio became a constant presence in my life, even if hidden. His every smile, his every gesture made me feel desired like never before. I knew that our relationship would never be official, that it could never replace what I had with Luca. But I was fine with that. Every meeting with Giorgio was like a forbidden taste of a life that didn't belong to me but which I desperately wanted. I remember one evening in particular, under a starry sky, when Giorgio took my hand and talked to me about how he had always wanted someone who really understood him. Those words made me tremble, because I realized that I too was looking for the same thing, a connection that went beyond appearances. And so I continued to betray Luca. Year after year, I lived this double life without him ever finding out. We appeared as a perfect couple in the eyes of the world, while I kept my secret in my heart. Every time we hosted a dinner with friends or family, I was amazed at how easily I could put on the flawless wife mask. Luca looked at me with eyes full of love, unaware of the parallel world I had built. But my relationship with Giorgio was not just passion. It was made up of moments of complicity, of shared laughter, of dreams whispered softly. He spoke to me about the future, about trips we could take together, about a life we knew was impossible. Every kiss of his seemed like a silent oath, every hug like a refuge. However, I knew that nothing would ever really change, and perhaps in some way I had resigned myself to that reality. It was a life intertwined with lies and forbidden desires, but it was now my life, and I no longer saw another possible path. I kept wondering if one day it would all fall apart, if the foundation on which I had built this double life would be solid enough to hold. But until then, I was just living one day at a time, caught between what I wanted and what I was afraid of losing. If you want to receive new videos of the series, write, "I want the sequel," in the comments. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to receive a preview of the next publications. Thank you.